Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today in Radom, Poland at the Fabryka Broni plant taking a look at the current new Polish Standard Army rifle. This is the MSBS, or the Modular Military Rifle Military Weapons System, aka the Grot, which is arrowhead or spearhead in Polish. This is an interesting project that developed a bunch of notoriety when it was announced, like at SHOT Show, when it was announced in the commercial realm, because this rifle was designed from the ground up to be configurable as either a standard configuration or a bullpup. And that got a lot of people's interest. But let's talk about that in a moment. First, the origins of the MSBS. This is developed essentially for the Polish military, and it came about because, well, the WZ-96 barrel, the last of the Polish AKs, was pretty obviously a developmental dead end. They'd taken the AK and they'd done pretty much everything that they could to it. It's got 300 different rails on it. It's got an adjustable buttstock. It's got enlarged controls, magazine release, safety, and it's still not really a modern rifle, but there's nothing more you can do to that. If you want to equip the Polish army with something better, you're going to have to start from scratch. And so that's what Fabryka Broni, the factory that was originally FB during the communist period in Poland, it became Work 11, the oval 11 emblem that you see on Polish AKs, and then came back, readopted the FB logo after the end of communism. At any rate, they got down to brass tacks and started designing a brand new rifle. Now, fundamentally, this rifle is one of the developmental iterations of the AR-18. It is a short-stroke gas piston, AR-style multi-lug rotating bolt. It takes a fair amount of inspiration from the SCAR as well, which you'll see in the use of an extruded aluminum upper receiver. But there are a few specific unique elements to it. So if we go back to the beginning here, the project began in 2007. There were the initial prototypes ready in 2008. In 2009, it had its first actual public demonstration. It was revealed to the public and started garnering some interest. However, this is a military project in Poland. It wasn't something that was going to develop extremely quickly. And between 2009 and 2013, there was a lot of bureaucratic friction. There was a lot of debate in the Army about, do we really want a new rifle, or maybe we can just get away with something cheaper by coming up with Stanag magazine adapters for our 5.56 AKs. This goes back and forth, and it really slows down development of the project at the Radom factory. By 2013, things are mostly done, but in a holding pattern waiting on the bureaucrats and the generals. Where this changes is in 2016, which is when a new Polish government creates a brand new branch of the Polish Armed Forces, and that is the Territorial Defense Forces. And this new government wanted to give the territorials all the best, brightest, greatest new equipment, and the MSBS is the natural option for them. And so the first contract for large-scale deliveries of the MSBS was signed in 2017. I should actually point out, before the first main contract, there were a couple of very small contracts. The actual first MSBS is adopted anywhere were a couple hundred of them for the Presidential Guard, the Ceremonial Guard. They were heavily modified rifles for ceremonial guard purposes. We'll take a look at one of those in a moment. That was the first batch that was sold. Second batch was then sold to the Border Guard Service, who were kind of not given any choice, but like the Ministry of the Interior was told, you're going to buy some of these, and so they did. And then that leads to a 50,000 unit order for the territorials. Now at this point, once the rifles for the territorial start being delivered, there are some shortcomings of the design that come to light, and we would proceed to have a couple years of rapid development and iteration, going from what was originally a standard Grot, which was then retroactively renamed the A0, modifications, improvements to the A1 pattern, and then a second set of modifications and improvements to the A2 pattern, and it is the A2 that is the standard production version today. So, with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a closer look at how this works internally and how the bullpup concept worked on it, because that's a really unique feature. All right, so here is the very first, actually the very first conceptual prototype of what the MSBS would become. This weighs basically nothing. There are no internals in it. It is simply a 3D printed proof of concept sort of mock-up. But it does show us some of the ideas that the designer had going into the project. You can see we have a removable separate lower assembly here, which would be made out of polymer, with an upper assembly running from here to here. This is the idea of a standard single type upper receiver, and it will be made much like the SCAR from aluminum extrusion with steel inserts for strength where required. And that's why there are, you can already see the attachments for screws built into this mock-up, and that is because they're using screws to attach steel reinforcements to the aluminum upper assembly. The short stroke gas piston was in the concept from the very beginning. There's your gas regulator, which is a separate 3D printed piece that's not quite pinned onto the barrel. But yeah, this serves simply to be a proof of concept. By 2008, there were firing prototypes ready, among them these two. These are then the rifles that would be presented in 2009 to the public for their first recognition or appearance in public. Now, by this point, you can see a lot of similarities with that first 3D printed mock-up, especially in the gas regulators. And there are substantial things that would change between here and the final production version of the gun. But you can see that we have the standard universal receiver concept in practice. If we go ahead and take a closer look at the rifle version, this is KO2, serial number 2 of the rifles, made by Fabryka Broni. I have gone ahead and pulled out the cross pin that holds on the buttstock. This just slides off the bottom like that. This is the exact same style of disassembly that we will see all the way through production. Just at this stage, they're using basically an AR buffer tube and AR stock, and that will change. The recoil spring at this stage comes out by pulling it down and then back. Captive recoil spring, a little bit of a buffer for end of travel impact. And then we have a reciprocating charging handle here, comes back to there, charging handle comes out, and then I can pull the bolt carrier out. And at this stage, we have sort of an AK style of bolt and carrier. It is a short stroke gas piston, but you've got the whole operating rod integral to the bolt carrier. And then of course down here we have our standard AR style of rotating bolt. The gas regulator at this stage was a very large assembly up here with 2 positions, one for normal and one for adverse. Now I can take the lower handguard off by pulling these 2 pins. There we go. And then that just lifts right off. And that is our upper receiver. It is worth pointing out here that we have an ejection buffer there and an ejection port cover here that can be flipped side to side. There is, you can see the controls here are ambidextrous. We can take this off and put it right there. This is not so important for the standard configuration rifle with it, which ejection side, but it does matter a lot more with the bullpup, where it must eject out the opposite side that the shooter is shooting off of. Now we can take a little bit of a closer look at the bullpup pattern here. This upper assembly is literally identical, and that's half of the point. You can see right there, it's exactly the same. What they've done is give it a different lower assembly that is going to contain all the same components, but move the trigger up to the front instead of being at the back. Where the full-length rifle had a fully contained handguard here, the bullpup version instead just has a short stub of Picatinny to give you a vertical hand grip, and that pins on exactly the same way that this side, that pins on exactly like the original handguard did. So for disassembly, we have essentially the exact same system here. the butt plate just slides up into a dovetail there. Just instead of it being only this tall, it now includes a bottom section to cover up the bottom of this, the lower receiver. So this is one of the 2 factory prototypes of the bullpup lower. It is, as you can see in here, also 3D printed as a factory prototype. They've got a fire control group up here with a long connecting bar that comes all the way back to the hammer back there. So this is one of the guns that was demonstrated in public in 2009, and that's the state of development there. So with firing prototypes in hand, we can fast forward another couple of years to about 2011. A few changes have been made. So on the one hand, the designers have been looking at some of the other rifles that are available on the market, and they've gotten some aesthetic inspiration, some ergonomic inspiration from rifles, in particular the ACR and also the Tavor X95 in terms of bullpup ergonomics. And at the same time, within Polish military circles, the MSBS rifle program has now been basically drafted into Project Tytan, which is Poland's version of the Future Soldier program that has been such a popular concept in a bunch of different countries over the years. So of course in the US we had Future Warrior and Land Warrior. The French had Félon. Well, the Poles had a similar project where we're going to have the most advanced futuristic programs. This is going to be integrated rifles and grenade launchers and bullpups and light machine guns and mounted machine guns and soldier integrated informational systems, and it's a whole huge project. And this would end up being a major problem for the rifle because, well, this Future Soldier program isn't going to go anywhere. And as long as the whole program doesn't go anywhere, the rifle is sort of stuck in a holding pattern where it can no longer be adopted on its own. And that's the state of the project in 2011. So this particular mock-up, again, 3D printed, totally inert. There are a couple different parts to it, but there's nothing metal here, nothing functional. But this shows you one of the more interesting combinations of parts, which is the bullpup rifle with an underslung 40mm grenade launcher, something that does actually help the bullpup version balance rather nicely. We have a second mock-up from about the same time period here. You can see we have integral pistol grips here, and the ergonomics have made a major leap forward from that initial firing prototype version to something pretty similar to the final production iteration of the MSBS. This is the form that the rifle was essentially in, really the final production form, but not yet in production, between about 2013 and about 2016. And during this time, it's part of this future weapons program. There's continued debate back and forth in the Polish MOD over, do we want a brand new rifle? Do we want to stick with things like this, 5.56 Stanag adapters to our AK platform? What's most cost effective? What's most practically effective? It's not until the formation of the Territorial Guard or the Territorial Forces that the rifle is yanked out of the Future Soldier program and able to be put into production itself. So let's take a quick look at what this actually was when it went into that initial production. We have here an FB, a Fabryka Broni logo on the side of the rifle. This dates back to the pre-World War II emblem of the factory. And by the way, Fabryka Broni just translates into arms factory. This one is produced in 2017. We have a caliber marking on here. They did, by the way, make versions of this in 7.62x39. That's part of the modular nature of the rifle, as they are able to develop different calibers. There's that FB Radom insignia molded into the lower receiver, and a serial number up here on both the upper receiver and the bolt. A few distinctive elements of the very first pattern of the rifle. One of them is the use of a Magpul MOE pistol grip. Early production, they were literally just buying Magpul grips from the United States. The Buttstock Design is now a collapsing and folding style. So we have a button right here that unlocks the stock and allows it to fold out. There is no solid lock when the stock's folded. It's just held in place by basically a little bit of spring tension from the hinge, and to open it, you just pop it out. You can also depress the button there and lengthen or shorten the stock. In fact, it has a cheek piece that is adjustable as well. If you pull the cheek piece back, you have 3 notches front and back. You can lift it up, you can angle it forward, backward, whatever you want. That is convenient to raise your cheek line of sight if you're using an optic. Maybe doesn't get you quite high enough for some optics combinations, but it's certainly a good start. The controls are completely ambidextrous. We have a 3-position selector switch, magazine release there. This lever acts as your bolt release and bolt catch. So it does lock open on an empty magazine, and then pushing that down releases the bolt. Pull the bolt back, lift that lever up, and it will lock the bolt open. The charging handle is non-reciprocating. However, once it snaps back and locks into the bolt for use manually charging the rifle, it does lock into the bolt and thus can also be used to pull the bolt forward if necessary. But when it snaps all the way forward, it sits up here and doesn't reciprocate. There are charging handles on both sides. Here are, of course, all 3 of our controls on the left. Like I mentioned earlier, in order to accommodate bullpup use, there's an ejection port on both sides with a cover that can be swapped from side to side. For disassembly, we fold the stock, push in this button here, which is the recoil spring, and I can then slide the stock down and off. Pull the recoil spring out. It's still captive, just like the original design, still has a little buffer on it. The lower assembly, the lower receiver, then pivots down. You can take it off by removing that pin. There we go, captive pin in the lower. One of the slightly odd things here is we have a polymer lower frame with a sheet metal box containing all of the fire control parts, kind of like one of the NHK G3 fire control cassette. So that's why you don't see any pinholes in the side of the lower here. All of the trigger is a self-contained unit. The bolt then just comes right out the back, nice and easily. If we look inside the receiver, you can see that there are a whole series of inserts in here. So there's a reinforcing insert on either side of the receiver. That's held in place by a couple of screws. We have our front trunnion that holds in the barrel, held in place by a couple of screws. We have a rear trunnion right here that locks in the stock assembly, also held in place by a couple of screws. So what you have here is an upper receiver that is aluminum made from an extrusion, which is a very efficient way to manufacture that. It is, in many ways, it's acting like a polymer receiver would, except you can actually mill a very solid Picatinny rail into aluminum, which you couldn't do on polymer. However, aluminum is still relatively soft, and if you're going to have a steel bolt traveling in an aluminum receiver, you want to have something to take up the wear, and so that's why you have all the steel inserts in there. Now, one of the other distinctive elements of the first version of the Grot, and one of the more significant problems for it would be this front handguard. So it is short, which is distinctive with the gas regulator exposed here at the front. The slots on this were Magpul MOE slots. At the time, this was sort of a holdover from the original production. Remember that this sat in limbo for several years, and it didn't really come to anyone's attention that by 2016, 2017, the MOE slots were not the most practical anymore, and it maybe wasn't well communicated to people in the field that these weren't actually M-LOK slots. And if you try to attach M-LOK accessories to them, despite the fact that they look very similar, you're going to get frustrated and maybe start grinding on things. So that would prove to be a problem. The gas regulator proved to be a bit of an issue. It is a 2-position regulator. There's 1. There's 2 for adverse. Disassembly requires only popping it a little bit farther down, and because this is exposed and because slings were being attached up at the front here, it was actually fairly easy for the regulator to be pushed out of firing position, pop like that down into disassembly position. And if this happens and you don't notice it and then you fire the rifle, well, the gas regulator goes flying down range. It's not dangerous, but it is embarrassing and leaves the rifle in a non-firing configuration. And by the way, that can happen on either side. You can push the gas regulator over to either side for disassembly. That would prove to be a problem. And then the last couple things to take a look at, there's a bayonet lug mounted on the barrel, extensive deep fluting in the barrel to reduce its weight, pretty basic birdcage muzzle device out at the front there. One last bit of disassembly we can do here is to pull off the handguard. This has a captive pin. We can pull that out. This slides off. It has two little locating lugs up on the front, and then the cross pin holding it in place at the back. Now, we have a quick change barrel here. We'll talk about that when we look at the current iteration of the rifle. But the one other thing that I want to show you, this is the original version. There was an A1 that was introduced with just a couple of minor changes, most significantly the addition of a QD slot to that front piece of Picatinny rail for attaching a sling. What I can also show you on this A1 handguard is this little bent piece of metal there, this little lug, which is the retrofit that is used for fixing the gas block, or the gas regulator issue on the original rifles. So if I drop this guy on, you can see that this bar is now blocking rotation of the gas regulator. You can still move it between position 1 and 2, but of course here you can't rotate it any further that direction, and when we move it to 1, you now still can't move it any farther in the other direction. So in order to disassemble the gas regulator, you have to take the handguard off first, and that guarantees that it can't happen accidentally. So that's the very simple, elegant little solution to this rather awkward problem with the gas regulator. With the rifle in full-scale production, mass orders for the territorial troops, and the issues with the original rifle were recognized, FB went ahead and developed the A2 version of the gun, and that really addresses all of the major issues that had come up in early production. So if we look at the front end of the rifle, for one thing, these now are M-LOK compatible slots. There's a bunch of handguard covers and a vertical front grip on this one. The handguard has been lengthened, so the gas regulator is no longer exposed and easily knocked off of setting by a sling or just any other obstacle out there. It's a little more difficult to adjust it. You now use a cartridge. You can, in fact, adjust it through that slot in the handguard there. That really solves that issue. There have been a number of minor changes to elements like the charging handles, which are just slightly larger, slightly thicker. They're made out of a slightly better material. The quality of some of the polymers was improved. As part of the large-scale production rollout, Magpul grips became a shortage in supply. They were a bottleneck in supply for completing rifles, and so FB went ahead and developed their own mold for their own pistol grip. They don't actually, it's interesting, everything that is not polymer is made on site by FB, barrels, surface treatments, and everything. They do outsource their polymer to a company in FB's same industrial group that does much large scale polymer, and some more efficient way for them to manufacture those parts. But anyway, the short version is they sourced their own pistol grips. They also sourced their own magazines. So they now have, it's the same thing, it's STANAG compatible, same capacity, but translucent and a distinctive green color, FB logo on the floor plate. They make their own magazines for them now. The flip-up iron sights are also made in-house by FB, and really not bad sights and very low profile, which is nice. For barrel removal, I figured I'd just show you on a cutaway rifle. So first step, we pull the handguard off. That's easy enough. Then the barrel is held in place by these two lugs that are on a single screw. So the two lugs are threaded in opposite directions. So all I have to do is take one side of this, unscrew it, basically just until it stops moving, like so. And then pull the bolt back to unlock it, and the bolt comes right out along with its gas assembly. And there's the front end. All you have to do to reinstall the barrel is put it back in and thread the screw out the other direction. And by the way, in case you were wondering about that bullpup model, well, the bullpup made it to, it made it to the original production version. These were never desired by the Polish Armed Forces. They took a look at it, decided that they were not particularly interested in the bullpup version. There is maybe some potential for limited commercial sale of these guys, or hypothetically a military contract for foreign export. But the bullpup version never got these A2 upgrades. You'll note that it's still using a Magpul grip, and it still has the earlier style of handguard slots. We have a short addendum here on grenade launchers. We have a couple different iterations of the underbarrel 40mm grenade launcher that FB designed for the rifle. This is the first version. It actually opens by pushing this lever at the front of the trigger guard. Pops open to the side. All of these are in fact side opening. That is preferential because it allows you to load particularly long grenades, things like flares or smoke, that you couldn't so much do in a sliding style of launcher. There is then a safety up here at the front and a trigger. Note that it's got this sort of built-in angled front grip design, very much like the 3D printed mock-up you saw earlier in the video. So this is all built onto a handguard, so it's very modular, drops right onto the rifle as either a bullpup or a conventional layout. Now, the version that actually got adopted is similar, but not quite identical. It is still a side opening design, but it now has a release at the back here, trigger at the back. You use the magazine as your grip instead of having an angled front grip style of system there. So this block, by the way, is the locking lug that locks onto this to hold the thing securely closed when you're firing a grenade. And in addition to being mounted on a handguard for the rifle, that is now also being made in a single-shot standalone design. So exactly the same grenade launcher, but with an extending shoulder stock, so you don't actually have to have the rifle to launch grenades. Today, there are a number of new developments that are still coming with the MSBS. There is development of a 7.62 NATO version, a scaled up version. There's also discussion of, well, there is production in Poland of semi-automatic civilian variants. There's talk about developing and exporting those to the United States as well, although that is not happening quite yet. This, I think, is a really interesting look at the true lifespan, or the true developmental cycle of a modern military rifle, being able to see everything from initial development, 3D printed early mock-ups, through to first production versions, through to the inevitable, like, here are some problems that we didn't find in field testing that you only discover when you get tens of thousands of rifles actually out in troops' hands. This is the sort of development that happens on virtually every rifle out there, but it's not that usual that we actually get a first-hand insight into all of those developments with the rifle's manufacturer. So a big thanks to Fabryka Broni for hosting me here at the factory, showing me around. We'll have a video tour of the factory as well. If you're interested, you can check out that video. And giving me access to everything from the 3D printed first conceptual prototypes through to the current iteration of production rifles. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.